It really is a great privilege to be with all of you tonight. I've learned so much from the courageous conversations and the work that Awake has been doing. I have tremendous respect for you in particular, Sarah, and the amazing team you've put together. So I'm really honored. And I just wanted to tell everyone a little bit about myself so they understand where I'm coming from for our conversation tonight. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm a native of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I grew up on 74th and Center and was a member of the St. Pius parish community for many years until my family moved to Mequon. And then I attended St. Cecilia and St. James, which is now part of the Lumen Christi community up in Mequon. But I've been Catholic educated since age 4. After my time up in Mequon, I moved down to 35th in Wisconsin and was educated at Marquette High, and then slid right down Wisconsin Avenue, as Sarah mentioned, and studied at Marquette U, and spent the first 25 years of my life in Milwaukee. After graduation, I was a director of youth ministry at 2 parishes on the west side of town, and really just found so much joy walking with young people as they tried to integrate their faith into the person they wanted to become. So I come as a faithful Catholic, as someone who is married in the church, and my wife and I are trying to raise our 3 children in the church. So I have a lot of love for the Catholic Church. And at the same time, I'm coming to see more and more the wounds that have been caused, not only in the church, but by the church. So tonight, I want to explain that I'm speaking as a Catholic moral theologian. My training is in Catholic social teaching. And I really wanted to avoid sexual ethics for most of my career because I thought that the church focuses too much on sexual ethics. There's a lot of judgment and stigma and shame around human sexuality. And this topic kind of found me just walking with people, trying to share life together. I wrote my dissertation on the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke's Gospel. And I realized that if I was going to try to practice what I was teaching and writing about, then I had to emulate the Samaritan, to avoid duplicating the behavior of the priest and the Levite and going out of my way to the other side, farther away from the person left for dead, which Pope Francis describes as the globalization of indifference. That's not my problem. And instead draw near to the person who's been beaten, robbed, and left for dead, and to take up that vantage point and make it my own in the spirit of compassion and solidarity. I originally got into this topic because I really wanted to focus on restorative justice and to bring about healing in the church. And I gave a paper at Villanova University 2 years ago, drawing on the work of Janine Geske at Marquette in Milwaukee. And the more work that I did on restorative justice, the more that I saw a need to really better understand the root causes of the problem and to listen to the voices of survivors. That we can't rush to justice or presume to know what justice entails unless and until we center the voices of survivors and let them lead the way forward toward what healing will look like, how do we redress harm that's been done, and try to ensure that there are no more cases of abuse in the church. So I'm speaking tonight with full humility. As a theologian, I see theology in the spirit of Karl Rahner's line that theology is inquiry, it's investigation, and it's a refusal to call a halt at any point. So please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to say anything that is exhaustive or definitive tonight. It's closer to a first word on this subject than the last word. And I really do try to take seriously my role as an advocate and an ally, not to speak as a voice for the voiceless, but to use my position as a scholar, as a teacher, as a theologian to try to make space, make room for survivors to be heard. And I know the experience of survivors is really diverse, it's not a one-size-fits-all experience. I know very often we focus on people who were abused as children, but we don't want to ignore those who were abused as adults. And even though my research project focuses mainly on moral injury caused by clergy sexual abuse, we also know that there have been many leaders in the Catholic Church who were not ordained and who still abused vulnerable folks and I don't mean vulnerable in a derogatory term. I think any time that we go to someone that we trust, we place ourselves in a position of vulnerability. And when that vulnerability is violated, there is a secret wound that results. And so that's really what I wanted us to try to spend some time with tonight, is to try to better understand the dimensions of that sacred wound. So here, I just want to, let's see, give you a kind of a brief overview of what to expect for tonight. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing tonight on this term moral injury, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. My hope is that it just serves as an interpretive lens to help us better understand the dimensions of the harm caused by abuse in the church, that we can understand what it is, why it happened, and how, and by better understanding the problem, hopefully that will inform the work that we can do to bring about healing and accountability and prevention. I also, as a moral theologian, I think that we too often neglect the way that this affects the entire church and not just the survivor community and their loved ones. I'm not trying to diminish the gravity of the impact on survivors, but I do think we fail to adequately address the toll this takes on the lay faithful as a whole. And I think it's important through not only the imagery we get in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where he talks about the church as a single body with many parts, where we are all connected and we share each other's burdens and rejoice together as well. But also to think seriously about the role of conscience and the church's moral authority and credibility. Then, in trying to make a constructive turn, I want to just highlight and sketch out for you some possibilities for the work that we can do in taking steps toward restorative justice. And then finally, I'd like to set up the conversation next Thursday, which we really do envision as a robust conversation in small and large group, where you have a chance to kind of unpack what this concept of moral injury has added for you to think about, and then also how we can stretch our imagination for what more is possible in terms of the truth-telling, accountability, and prevention work that needs to happen in our church. So, as I mentioned, tonight I'm going to be focusing on moral injury. My work has been informed by a grant that I received from Fordham University's Taking Responsibility Initiative. It's a 2-year study. Well, with the pandemic, it's been extended another 6 months, so it's about a 2.5-year study. And for basically the last year, I've been reading nonstop about this new concept called moral injury, which really has been focused most principally in veterans returning from war. And that's not to say that this is the only example of moral injury, but I think it helps illustrate what I mean by this term. That it's not a perfect term to understand the harm that's been done, but to show that there is something more than trauma or sin, because I think most often we kind of just think about evil in those categories of trauma or sin. So moral injury, as it's been measured really mostly since the 90s and moving forward, is focusing on this experience of dissonance and disorientation in soldiers who either participated in or witnessed acts that transgressed, that violated their moral code. And I think this term moral injury is appropriate. Language matters because words create worlds. It helps us to understand the human experience a little bit more precisely and with greater detail. And so the moral part is not just right or wrong. That's certainly a part of it. But if you think about, just the good life and what it means to be human and what God wants for and from us, those are all moral questions, and really trying to orient ourselves to human flourishing. And so that's the dimension of moral here, is that this is an experience of evil that really kind of interrupts what we previously expected of ourselves and other people. And the injury, term is to show that this isn't necessarily a permanent condition, that kind of like a physical injury, it can be very serious, it can be grave, in some cases it can be life-threatening. but there is a hope for healing and for recovery. And so I don't want to think of it as a permanent impairment or as determining someone's life afterwards, but it is something that desperately needs our attention. And so you can see on the screen here that I've tried to sketch out just some of the dimensions of moral injury so that we can better understand, what this term means, that often this is caused by an abuse of power by an authority figure. You can think of a soldier in war who's, commanding officer gives them a command, to attack an enemy force, and it turns out that there were civilians there, or there's a drone strike, and we see that children were targeted and killed. And so there's this sense of betrayal. I trusted you to make a good judgment. I trusted that we were going to follow this code rooted in honor and loyalty, and there's this transgression or betrayal that is so disorienting. And there's this inner conflict, to try to make sense of who am I after I either saw this happen or that I actually participated in this act. And usually what we see is kind of diminished vitality and value for self and others. The work of some theologians and psychologists on this in this area have described this as souls in anguish. So they're tormented by this event, and you can think of the trauma or PTSD that kind of flows afterwards, where they feel untethered both to their own sense of worth and worthiness, but also to the good, the vision of themselves that they hoped to aspire to, and for many, for God. How could God allow such evil to happen or to happen to me? And of course, this is compounded by psychic trauma. And if you missed the courageous conversation last year with Dr. Stephen Saunders, I thought his presentation on trauma was really illuminating to show just the layers of trauma. This isn't like getting cut on the hand and then being able to put a bandage on it, or breaking a bone and getting the x-ray and being able to see it. There's so much more to trauma and the way that the brain responds to trauma. The loss of memory, what returns in waves, the nightmares, the loss of the ability to connect and feel safe and to trust others. So it's personal, but it's also interpersonal. And as we can see in the military, it's also institutional in the sense that this impacts, not just individuals, but entire communities. So I think, hopefully you're beginning to see this is a suitable kind of springboard or parallel for what we might recognize in the church, for trying to make sense of how this kind of moral crisis could affect a loss or change in identity, agency, relationships, or understanding the meaning and purpose of life. So as a theologian, I'm wondering, where is God in the church abuse scandal and its cover-up in the Catholic Church? And how can I, as a theologian, try to help people make sense of what's happened and not just answer questions like why and how, but to turn our focus to what does God want for and from us in this situation where we're staring evil in the face? And I think, just for my own sake, it really helps to begin with this image that I have on the right. This is from the church Sagrada Familia in Barcelona by the architect Gaudí, where you can see Jesus is embracing the pillar as he's scourged right before being crucified. In our kind of in our framework, we don't like to think of Jesus as having a penis or being naked, but the fact of the matter is that when Jesus was tortured before he was killed, he was stripped naked as an act of humiliation and sexual torture. So I think to identify Jesus as a survivor of sexual violence reminds us that if we're looking for where God is in this crisis, God is with the survivors, that Jesus identifies himself with the survivors. And if you'd like to read more about this, there's a really excellent book that just came out earlier this year called When Did We See You Naked? Jesus as a Victim of Sexual Abuse, which is a really eye-opening book on that topic. So as I mentioned, my scholarship, my research is really focusing on clergy sexual abuse. And we know abuse is not restricted to clergy, but as you can see on the screen, I think very often in the church, we kind of think of this, or the church presents this as there are just a few bad apples. And we know, and we're still learning, as people come forward, to raise their voice and to be heard, that this isn't just a crisis in the church, this is a moral catastrophe, where there are more than 100,000 survivors of clergy sexual abuse who've been abused by more than 4,000 clergy. My own life was touched by this. I grew up as an altar server in St. James Parish up in Mequon, and I served for a priest, Father Edmund Hain, who was credibly accused by abuse and actually admitted to the abuse before he died. He baptized my youngest sister, which is an experience that still to this day kind of sickens her, that his hands touched her and were part of her baptism, and she has decided not to participate in the Catholic Church any longer and not to baptize her children in the church, even though she was Catholic educated from 4 to 22, and for whom, you know, her Catholic identity was a big part of her life. And I have to say, for me as a kid, it was strange, you know, to have Father Hain on the altar for my first communion as a second grader, and to have our parish hall named Hain Hall, to honor this priest, even after the allegations came out. The allegations came out in 1989, and Hain Hall was on the wall of the parish even after those allegations. And so I point to that in the way that the church, you know, even recently, I would say even now, still, I think the knee-jerk reaction is to protect perpetrators and to discourage victims from speaking out and from being heard, to cast doubt on survivors. And so when I'm looking at moral injury in the church, I am certainly focused on the experience of survivors, but I also want to widen the scope to think about how this impacts their loved ones, how this impacts the lay faithful, how this impacts clergy, the church as a whole. I also think it's really important to point out that even though there's been a lot written about moral injury, experienced by soldiers returning from combat, that's a very different experience of moral injury. And so, as Sarah mentioned, my book project is really trying to show how clergy sexual abuse is its own kind of its own experience of moral injury, and as part of a wider taxonomy of moral injury. Because, you know, in war, you know, soldiers are trained for combat. They know what to expect. And there is a lot of support that's offered, maybe not enough support given the trauma that veterans experience. And we know the fallout. I mean, every 27 hours a veteran dies by suicide. So I think we failed our veteran population in a lot of ways. And yet, to have this vulnerability violated in a church or near a church or in a rectory, or, you know, in some terrible situations in a confessional, you know, this is supposed to be a safe space, to say nothing of a sanctuary or a place that is supposed to be revered. When I listen to survivors, they describe their experience of abuse as, you know, for some, the rape of their soul, and for others, the murder of their soul. Not just because of the experience of abuse, but who the priest represents, you know, as representative of the church, or as God. And so to have someone who's supposed to be, you know, so well respected or revered or held up on a pedestal do something that is so torturous, this is an abuse of sacred trust. It's an experience of spiritual abuse, and it leaves a sacred wound that is beyond trauma, is beyond sin, that kind of connects the soul to the psyche and to one's conscience. And I'll talk more about conscience in a moment. So I think too, you know, in the Catholic Church especially, there's a culture of secrecy, and certainly the culture of clericalism really makes it hard for survivors to be heard, for there to be much truth-telling and accountability. Very often, you know, in the research that I was doing for restorative justice, we hear that that clergy refuse to participate in any kind of ritual for truth-telling, to express lamentation, and you know, Janine Geske has organized these healing circles where people can go around and speak in a first-person voice. This is what this experience was like for me. And it is exceedingly rare to get clergy to participate in that. And when they do, too often, people complain that they show little to no remorse. And very many times, clergy hide behind the sacrament of reconciliation. and they say, I've confessed my sins, I've done my penance, what more do you want from me? And that lack of remorse, that lack of sorrow, I think only compounds the pain. And often, even when it's hard for survivors to find any recourse for being heard and for any accountability or acknowledgement of the harm that's done to them, they're forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. So to continue to kind of keep the veil of secrecy, to kind of prop up this culture of entitlement and protection that the church uses as an excuse to try to protect people from scandal, but is actually hiding people from the truth of what's happening in our faith communities. And because the church is such an important part of people's identity, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, I'm a lifelong Catholic educated, trying to raise my children in the church. It's constitutive of my identity. It's by virtue of baptism, of course, that's true. But it's hard to imagine myself as anything but Catholic. It's in my bones. It's not like, where do I buy my groceries today? Do I go to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's? Just like one option among many. It's being incorporated into this this body of Christ. And when abuse happens, and the cover-up, which compounds the problem, the refusal to acknowledge the pain, that I think not only is there a loss of moral authority and credibility for people to say, well, I don't know that I can trust the church or believe the church, but also I think there's a real struggle within to say, how could I be a part of a community that allows this to happen, or that is indifferent to this kind of pain and suffering and these wounds, or that isn't doing more about this problem? I always think of that line that's often attributed to Mother Jones: if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And there are sparks, or kind of peaks of outrage here and there. Like when the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out in August of 2018, there was, kind of a big cry, that this is unjust, and people shaking their fist. But maybe some people use that to leave the church, but I think a lot of people, too many people, just continued as business as usual. And I remember at one of the courageous conversations last year, a survivor saying, I'm sick of people telling me to just get over the abuse. There's no getting over it. There's only getting through it. But we can't just push it to the past or pretend that it didn't happen or sweep it under the rug. So moving on as business as usual really isn't an option. But it seems to me that, even like with what Pope Francis has tried to do with Vos Estis Lux Mundi, where the church is trying to encourage reform, it's not doing enough to mandate it. There aren't enough teeth to really encourage or ensure enforcement. And so we've got to, I think, wrestle with that a little bit more. I think of that line by St. Augustine. He says, "Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain the way that they are." And so I hope that kind of that lens of, trying to hold together the anger and the courage can kind of move us forward with eyes full of hope, that we can see the wounds, to acknowledge the moral injury on the individual, the interpersonal, and the institutional levels, this body of Christ imagery, but also to not just throw up our hands, in kind of a move of despair and just say, there's nothing we can do, or all hope is lost. So I saw, or hopefully you saw in the title that, tonight we're talking about the body of Christ as a body of broken bones. I wanted to share that the source for that, as at least in my own work, is this passage from Thomas Merton and his reflection in the 60s about Christ suffering dismemberment. So if we take seriously this idea that moral injury is happening on the individual and the interpersonal and the institutional levels, that this is a wound, the whole church, really no exceptions. And this isn't a new insight, right? Because I'm trying to point back to Merton's acknowledgement of this. He pointed to war, poverty, racism as all experiences of this body of broken bones. that divides us, that does the exact opposite of what St. Paul says in his first letter to the Corinthians, where he's trying to call for unity and a celebration of diversity and to honor each and every part as equal in dignity and value. And also then to honor the wounds in each and every part and to be sensitive, acutely aware, and responsive to the needs of each and every part. And Merton's reflection here is that as long as we are here on earth, the love that unites us will bring us suffering by our very contact with one another, because this love is the resetting of a body of broken bones. And he says that sacrifice and sorrow are the price of this resetting of bones. And I think that for a lot of people, they decide to leave the church because they don't see sufficient sacrifice and sorrow. They don't see the willingness to lament and atone for what's been done, or a commitment to ensure there will be no more or no new survivors of abuse. So my hope is that we can use this imagery to better understand kind of the effect that this has on us and people we care about, the effect that this has on our parish communities. As I mentioned, working in a parish ministry setting for 4 years, I saw how, at its best, a parish can be at the very center of people's lives, there for the baptisms, the weddings, and the funerals. And when my daughter Grace was born, I know the parish we belong to here in Cincinnati came up with a meal train so that we had people come in once a week for a number of weeks to bring us a meal to help make things easier on my wife and my children and myself. That we can show up for each other, whether it's for bereavement or for social ministry or the liturgy. But I don't know how many people really feel like their faith life is still orbiting around the parish. I think a lot of people think of the parish now as kind of a place where sacraments get dispensed, where we show up when we're expected to, or if we're feeling like it. But I hope that we can see also the parish as a place for not only woundedness, but potential healing. And that's what I hope we'll talk about next week, is how do we on the local level tap into existing relationships and networks where there is a sense of safety and trust, and leverage that to do the truth telling, to share stories, to dream together, as Pope Francis says in his most recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti, of what more God can make possible in and through us, not just as isolated individuals, but when we come together and share our gifts and talents and commitments as a community. I also think it's really important that we talk about conscience. I know I'm a moral theologian, so I'm probably biased here, but I think that very often the experience of survivors is one of wound upon wound, or pain upon pain, where this violation of vulnerability takes place. It's not acknowledged. People cast doubt on them or blame them, like, how could you say such a thing about Father so-and-so, or how could you do this to our faith community? Or survivors have forgiveness imposed on them, that Jesus tells us we have to forgive not 7 times, but seven times 7, or 70 times 7, this infinite number. And I've been told, so many times that survivors were told to pray for their perpetrator. And I think of Esther Harber's really poignant presentation last year. If you haven't seen that courageous conversation, it's certainly a powerful testimony about the ways that survivors are so mistreated long after the abuse. And we kind of impose all the forgiveness, the healing, the reconciliation on them, expect them to do the heavy lifting, which is so unfair. And these are all moral issues. So, I want to point out the ways in which the tradition can really better honor what the church actually teaches, so that, we don't say terrible things like, I just heard from a woman who was older than her abuser, who was a priest. And when she tried to give voice to this experience, up the chain of the command, she was told to try to love him like a grandmother would, which just makes me, makes my stomach turn. Just that, people would be told that the onus is on them to love the abuser, to forgive the abuser, rather than to bring the abuser to account. I think too, a lot of people think of conscience as, Jiminy Cricket, whispering in their ear, or an angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. And it's less a thing than actually an innate capacity, activity, and lifelong process of being formed by scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. I think it's worth pointing out that the Catechism says that the conscience is the vicar of Christ. That word vicar is strange to us. It really comes from Europe, where the vicar is the representative of the king, and you have to treat the vicar as if you were in the presence of the king. But to think of that, is that the conscience is the representative of Christ to us and in us, that it's the sanctuary where we can hear the voice of God. And of course, Aquinas taught long ago that it's a sin to go against one's well-informed conscience. So conscience is this lifelong process to order, interpret, and discern what is right, true, good, and just. And that it's not just about selecting it, in a moral dilemma, like a case study, like a what would you do kind of thing, but to really try to become the kind of people who are inherently patient, who are inherently generous, who are inherently honest, right? So that the virtues become like second nature to us, not trying to think, oh, what would be the courageous thing to do in this situation, but how can I be a person who's more consistently exercising the virtue of courage or generosity or compassion or any other virtue for that matter. But I think really, important for our conversation tonight is the etymology of the word conscience means to know together. It literally means that conscience is not a private affair. It's personal, but it's not private, that it's dialogical, that we come to know what is right, true, good, and just by being in relationship with other people, by dialoguing with the church, with our sacred texts, with our tradition, and because other people can see things that we can't because of our biases and blind spots. And that's true for other people as well. And so collectively, right, by sharing our stories, by reflecting on our experience, by praying together, dialoguing together, that collectively we can try to get a fuller, deeper, richer grasp of the truth of reality so that we can take responsibility for trying to bring about the reign of God in our midst as God's partners. But importantly, right, if conscience means to know together, that means that when the church props up secrecy, when it silences survivors, when it tries to move on as business as usual, it prevents people from knowing the truth of what's been happening in our faith communities. And when we deny people the truth, we can't help but deaden the conscience, right? People can't make well-informed judgments about what is right, true, good, and just. They can't rightfully trust the church if they don't know all the ways that the church has betrayed them or other people. And so I think, we have to look at not only the problem of the secrecy, the stigma, the shame, all the silence around this issue, but also pay attention to the policies and practices that are perpetuating this. I think of the courageous conversation last year with Aaron Lindstrom, who shared about his brother Nate's experience with a religious order up in Green Bay, the Palatines, I think. And we know that there was a lot of abuse in religious orders because there isn't the same oversight in the religious orders as there is in the diocese, which isn't to say that there wasn't abuse at the diocesan level, but to pay attention to that, and we also are learning more and more that there was disproportionately high rates of abuse in low-income communities and in communities of color, where again, it was perpetrators taking advantage of especially marginalized and vulnerable populations, people who didn't have the social capital, who couldn't pick up the phone and call, a lawyer or a judge or a police officer, someone that they knew or was in the family who could advocate on their behalf. And so they were targeted precisely because they were socially marginalized by, a socioeconomic class or ethnicity. And so we have to bring this into the light so that we can see the truth for what it really is and take responsibility for what's happened in our faith communities. I also think too, that it's true that evil is a part of the human experience, that sin is always and everywhere present, that there is no perfect community or perfect society. Even if I've ever been tempted to stop being a practicing Catholic, I know that there's no perfect faith community for me to join, no sinless community that awaits me. And that's not to normalize it, but it is to then try to think about, again, that theological question of where is God in the experience of evil or in the experience of sin? What is God trying to do or make possible? And so I think for here, the image on the right here is an example of kintsugi pottery, which you may be familiar with. It's a tradition actually in Japan where pottery is broken on purpose and then woven together or bound together through gold. That's where the word kintsugi comes from, mending with gold. And the idea is that actually, thanks to the gold, the finished product, even though it's shards of broken pottery, is actually more beautiful than it was before it was broken. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that everything happens for a reason or God has a plan or that God would intend for any of these to happen. That's certainly not the case. I think the whole point of the crucifixion is to unmask that, God sent God's son as an act of love. And how did humans respond? We responded with fear and hatred and violence. This barbaric act should shock us and shame us into thinking about how we should respond to this invitation to receive and return God's love and to love one another as we are loved by God, as Jesus commands us in the Gospel of John. So I'm not saying that the wounds are at all part of God's design, but I do think that if we look at the wounds maybe in our own lives, we can see that that it's possible for the pain not to be a prison, but to actually be a portal. That there can be transformation. Going back to St. Augustine, he talked about the wounds of a persecuted church and of the experience of martyrs. And he said, this persecution, the murder of Christians, this is supposed to bring disfigurement to the body of Christ and dishonor, but it actually does the opposite. It brings dignity, because in the wounds, that's where the light of Christ shines. And I do think about that, that even though Jesus endured this torture and this barbaric death on the cross, Jesus was lashed 39 times because the Romans thought that if you whipped someone 40 times, it would kill him. So he was taken within an inch of his life. In crucifixion, they stripped you naked to, humiliate you and then break your legs so that you can't support your own weight on the cross, so that Jesus dies, but being mocked by a crowd through asphyxiation. That the way that he's tortured, that even on Easter Sunday, when Jesus resurrected, the resurrected Christ still bears the marks of that humiliation and of that torture. The resurrected Christ is not a Jesus where those wounds are erased. And I draw inspiration too from the work of Greg Boyle. You may know him. He does the work of a pastor at Homeboy Industries in East LA, where he was missioned to work with former gang members. He's written 2 really beautiful books, Tattoos on the Heart and Barking to the Choir. He has a 3rd book due out next month. I think it's called The Whole Language, which I can't wait to read. But this passage from Barking to the Choir really, I think, strikes to how do we do the work of trying to heal wounded consciences and to do the soul repair that's so deeply needed. And Boyle reminds us that in a cultural context where we're always measuring ourselves, or we feel like a disappointment or not enough, whether to God or to other people, that what we need instead of judgment is awe, to stand in awe at what other people carry. And he says too that, standing at the margins with the broken reminds us not of our own superiority, but of our own brokenness, so that we can acknowledge those wounds instead of hiding them or pretending they're not there or being ashamed of them, like Jesus with doubting Thomas, to let people put their hands in the wounds, not, to exploit the wounds or, to sensationalize them. Certainly, I don't mean to tokenize anyone's woundedness or to be flippant about the depth or breadth of those wounds. And I wouldn't want to trigger people to think like, oh, you have to share them or load on other people. But I think we need to acknowledge that we all carry some degree of woundedness, and not to compare anyone's wounds to anyone else's, but just to admit that no one escapes the human condition without these wounds and flaws and marks. and that we all deserve this awe, just because people are carrying their burden well doesn't mean it's not a really heavy burden to carry. And if we embrace our own suffering, it can help us to land on this spiritual intimacy with ourselves and others. For if we don't just welcome our own wounds, we will be tempted to despise the wounded. I often think of that line in Evangelii Gaudium from Pope Francis, where he calls for this need for a revolution of tenderness. And I think that that's really what the church needs. Rather than distance, rather than growing apart, rather than the I do me, you do you, you stay in your lane, that I'll stay in mine, that's not my problem, or I've got enough on my plate. We need that tenderness to draw closer to each other, to share life together, and to figure out how we can do this healing work together. So in this move toward restorative justice, and to kind of invite you to think about the role that you can play here, because I do think it is a role for, there is a role for everyone. When I was an undergraduate student at Marquette, I had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with Archbishop Desmond Tutu when he was brought to campus for a mission week. And I remember him talking about the work of justice like an orchestra. And I have no musical inclination or talent at all. I have the rhythm of a tree stump. And I remember, kind of pushing back on that a little bit and saying, well, what about me? What can I really offer? And Archbishop Desmond Tutu came right back at me. He wouldn't let me off the hook. And he said, even if the only instrument you could play is the triangle, then play the hell out of the triangle for justice. And so that's the invitation here, is if we take seriously that moral injury is something that's experienced on the individual level, on the interpersonal level, on the institutional level, then we all have an instrument to play or a role to fill in trying to bring about the truth-telling, the healing, the accountability, in a spirit of co-responsibility, to not only redress the harm that's been done, but also to try to prevent this from happening. So I think it might be helpful just, because justice for some people means vengeance. For other people, they think of the criminal justice system, in terms of a punitive dimension. Really, the classic definition means giving each person what is due to them, what they deserve. And that includes, redress for harm done. So as I've mentioned, right, there are these necessary ingredients, the work that has to happen individually, interpersonally, and institutionally. And I think to orient ourselves that if moral injury is a kind of desecration of people not being able to see themselves being made in the image and likeness of God, and we hear this often from survivors, this deep sense of shame, of anger and guilt, of betrayal, of numbness, of futility, why bother? I don't have a real agency anymore. Then we have to do the work of reconsecration. And I don't mean that like, a purity culture way, where people reconsecrate themselves to Christ and, try to be free of sin. I mean that we have to do the work of really trying to help one another see the holy in our midst, even in the face of the wounds, to help people rediscover their inherent dignity, that they don't deserve any kind of abuse or gaslighting, that they do deserve our time and attention. And that, that line, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention, that's tough because, anger comes to us, as Aquinas tells us, anger is almost always in response to an injustice, right? Like if you think about times in your life when you've been angry, it's probably because you perceived something was deeply unfair. So anger isn't bad, even though as a kid, I was kind of socialized that, when I was angry, that was a bad feeling, because it's pointing us to an injustice that we need to correct. But we also, anger can be really dangerous, right? It can exhaust us, it can overwhelm us, it can destroy, right? It can be destructive. And so to think about what is the way that we try to sustain this energy, to make this a lifelong commitment and not just something that we opt into or opt out of at will or when it's comfortable or convenient, or when there's a news story or a grand jury report, and then just slide back into business as usual. So to do that, to make this kind of a sustained effort and to do this together, I wanted to highlight some obstacles for us to overcome and to kind of invite you to sit with these in the next week and think about how do we overcome these obstacles together as a community, where we are locally, but also knowing that this is not just work that's on our shoulders alone. So certainly I think, part of the problem is that purity culture. You look at someone like Mary, clergy love to point to Mary as, the highest aspiration of the human, right? Cardinal Dolan always says, we ennoble women because of the way we elevate Mary. But I think there's also a trap there, right? Because we show for women in particular, there's two ways to be a woman if you want to be like Mary, either virgin or mother. And if you're not one of those two things, then where do you belong in the church? So that purity culture, I think, can contribute to a lot of silence, stigma, and shame around human sexuality, rather than helping us to honor it as a gift, to be co-creators with God, and to take responsibility for it as a gift, but also a task. The culture of clericalism and patriarchy, I think, not only entitles and protects clergy, but it also disempowers the laity. When I was in graduate school learning about the early church, it was fascinating to see the example of the early church, before Constantine made the Catholic Church the official religion of the Roman Empire, when it was still a persecuted church. You saw a community of co-equals where there wasn't this hierarchy, modeled after the Roman Empire. You had women in positions of power. And I think that's really important because so often women are whistleblowers. They're the ones who are trying to speak truth to power now. They're advocates and allies, vocal advocates and allies in the church. And they're resisting, the ways that they are being excluded from the decision-making bodies and rooms. There's that HR line, that personnel is policy. When only men or only celibate men are in the room making decisions or writing policies, we are leaving out so many perspectives and life experiences and preventing against that vision of co-equality and co-responsibility. And we see that in the top-down power structures, that this hegemony that we have in the church that does disempower, that kind of treats people and trains people to see themselves more as spectators than as participants or stakeholders. And just as an example, if you look at canon law, it says that every parish should have a finance council and a parish council. But if you note, the language is that those councils are consultative, that they can advise the pastor, but the ultimate power still lies with the pastor. And so in the system that we have, laity don't have as much real power as we might think, at least according to canon law. And even if you try to bring your complaints to the USCCB, they either defer to the local bishop or tell you to go to Rome. But there isn't as much oversight as you would see in maybe a secular organization, where there's a real clear chain of command, or this is where you go if you need to make your voice heard. And so we have to change the structures and systems and the personnel who's doing this. And again, I point to Vos Estis, Lux Mundi, where again, Pope Francis's approach seemed to be more to encourage than to mandate. And that has to change. I mentioned before the way that communities of color, low-income communities were targeted. We have to acknowledge the racism that's a part of the clergy abuse story in the church and the cover-up. Abusers were often sent into communities of color or low-income communities or to Native American reservations because they were isolated, because they weren't, they didn't have the same social power to be able to speak up or to be able to figure out, like, how do we hold this priest to account or this religious leader to account? And I think, really in almost every social problem that we have, the three real big threats are ignorance, people who just aren't aware of the problem or who are unwilling to learn more about it; indifference, that going back to the story of the Good Samaritan, the priest, the Levite, the people who say, I'm too busy, or I have enough on my plate, or that's not my problem, or who am I to help? Just this feeling of unworthiness. I think that all contributes to the globalization of indifference that keeps people from going into the ditch and rolling up their sleeves, taking up the vantage point of the marginalized and the vulnerable and making it their own and figuring out, what do I see now that I'm in this space that I didn't before? How can I make these problems my problems and to work as a partner? And then finally, the problem of inaction, to say, all right, I'm upset about this, I'm concerned about this, I feel compassion for survivors, I feel outraged at what's being done in my church or what's being covered up, but I don't know what to do. And so, what are the tools in the tool belt that we can put so that people understand there are action steps that we can take to claim the power that we do have? So my hope is that we can move in the direction of trying to practice compassion, solidarity, and hope, that these are virtues that require habits so that they can become, part of our character. That was Aristotle's insight long ago. We are what we repeatedly do. So if we want to be compassionate people, we have to practice compassion until it becomes like second nature to us. And I think, in fairness as well, we're learning more and more from psychologists that it's not enough to say we are what we repeatedly do, that the most potent formation actually happens through our relationships and shared rituals, that we are what we repeatedly do together. I always think of the case of Les Chambons, this little village in southern France, a village of just a little bit more than 2,000, who smuggled and protected and helped more than somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Jewish people evade Nazi detection. So they welcomed them in to their community, or they sent them over the Alps to the Swiss, or they forged documents. They doubled the population of their town at great risks to themselves. And when sociologists and psychologists came and said, why would you take on that much risk? I mean, how could you be sure that the Nazis weren't going to detect that the population of your town doubled with Jewish refugees that you were harboring or trying to help deliver to safety, to send to neutral Switzerland? And the people of Les Chambons just looked around at each other, kind of bewildered at the question, and said, this is just who we are. This is what we do here. They were a community of Protestant French people surrounded in Catholic southern France who had experienced persecution themselves, who felt vulnerable and isolated. And so they rallied, and they just made it second nature to the community. And so I think that's the invitation, to think about this not as an immense weight on my shoulders or your shoulders, or to think about this only in the individual lens, but to think about how can we bring this into our existing relationships. And I think taking seriously this idea that social transformation happens at the speed of relationships, and relationships move at the speed of safety and trust, means that we have to invest more in relationships to help people feel like we can be part of communities of healing. And I love this line from bell hooks on the right, that healing doesn't happen in isolation. Maybe we think of that in kind of a clinical setting where someone sits down with a counselor or a therapist, and they have to do the hard work, or they go through a 12-step program, and they have to make that progress by themselves, or that recovery, or with a mentor. But I think if we look seriously at the times where we have fallen down and needed to get back up, it was other people who reached out a hand to us, or to reassured us, you are stronger than you think, or you are capable, that we don't do that healing. We can't be resilient all by ourselves, that we do this together. So that's part of what we're hoping we can talk about next week, is what does that look like when we bring this into our relationships and into our neighborhoods and communities? And then, to think about this on the macro level, paying attention to the exercise of power, who makes decisions, who's benefiting, who's suffering, to try to do the social analysis to understand what's causing these problems to continue, to not be adequately addressed, and to not be resolved, so that we can think about this. I know that's hard, for a global church that's over 1 billion strong across the whole globe. The North American Catholic Church is only about 5% of the global Catholic Church. So we're just a drop in the bucket, but I think we have to think about those policies and procedures, the structures and systems that continue to protect perpetrators, that silence victims, or that encourage people to just move on as business as usual, or to think that the answer is to leave or to stop donating money. I worked in parish ministry. As I said, I was making $30,000 a year, working 60 to 80 hours a week. I know there's a ban the basket movement, that hoping that if people withhold financial contributions, that will get the church's attention. I'm not saying don't do that, but I do feel a little bit nervous about that, because I know that will hurt church employees, people who are in the trenches trying to run first communion programs, or doing the bereavement society, or planning liturgy. And so we have to think about the big picture and the role that we can play together, rather than just making this an individual decision to opt in or opt out. So that's the invitation, and hopefully there's plenty there for you to think more about, to question, and to imagine possible. And I just wanted to give you a minute to kind of gather your thoughts, to think about what you've heard, what it adds for you to think about in terms of the ripple effects of abuse in this body of broken bones, and how we do the work of sorrow, sacrifice, and love that's required to reset those broken bones, as Merton saw so many years ago. And while you're collecting your thoughts, I just wanted to share this image that you can see at the bottom of your screen. So this image actually comes from El Salvador, in the Church of the Rosary in San Salvador. And well, about 50 years ago, no, 40 years ago, 40 years ago, there was an attack on a church while people were worshiping, and there were hundreds of people in the church, and the army was firing into the church with bullets. And I think about a little bit more than 30 people were killed in the church. You can still go to this church in El Salvador and see the holes in the metal doors. And this image is a tabernacle that's in the way back of the church, 100 yards from the doors. And you can see in the image, maybe not very well, but hopefully you can see there's actually a bullet hole in the tabernacle because a bullet pierced, where the Blessed Sacrament was being held. But the Blessed Sacrament was not pierced by the bullet. The bullet hit the glass and stopped. And for me personally, I find great consolation when I am able to visit this tabernacle, to know that, again, Christ is with the victims, that Christ bears the wounds of the victims in his own body that was stripped naked and tortured, that Christ is right here with us in this moral reckoning for our church. But the evil, the sin, the moral injury does not win out. It doesn't vanquish the light of Christ, the real presence of Christ in our church, the presence and power of the Holy Spirit. I don't know if you know that, but the word for the Holy Spirit in the Christian scriptures is the Greek word dynamis, which means power. That's where we get the word for dynamite. So when scripture invokes the Holy Spirit, it's actually talking about God's gift of God's own power to us, to be partners in using that power for building right relationships in our communities. So I just leave that image with you to just think a little bit more about how we can not only be more attentive and responsive to the presence of the Holy Spirit and to Jesus in our midst and to Jesus in the survivors themselves, but also the way that the gifts of the Spirit are calling and empowering us to respond to this moral catastrophe in our church.
Thank you, Marcus. You've given us so much to chew on. My name is Erin O'Donnell, and I'm a member of Awake's leadership team. I'm also editor of Awake's blog. I would encourage you to take a peek. We have new content every week. And so let's move on now to audience questions. As we mentioned earlier, please send your questions to Catherine through the chat. She's been sending them on to me. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for the folks who have already been sending questions in. We have a lot of good ones, and I hope we'll have time to get to a good chunk of them. So to start us off, we have a great question from one of our community members who's here with us this evening. Her question is, what steps, Marcus, what steps can parishes take to make the abuse crisis a topic of conversation, to both foster awareness and healing in our parishes?
Thanks, Erin. I think there are a lot of things that people can do. Certainly, if this is not a topic that's come up from your pastor or from the pulpit, I think it's good to ask about it. Like, is this something you've given thought to or would like to talk about? Or do you feel well informed or comfortable addressing this topic? I know in my entire life, going to church, I never heard about clergy sexual abuse in a homily. It was the elephant in the room even after the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out. And that refusal to acknowledge it, I can appreciate you don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but at the same time, if we're never going to acknowledge it, how is the problem ever supposed to be resolved? So I think, too, having worked in parish ministry, I know that pastors are already stretched very thin. And so to just add a problem and lay it in the pastor's lap is not necessarily helpful. So to share resources, to point them to the Awake Milwaukee website, to say, these are some great conversations that you can tune into and watch. Maybe they even, you invite them to watch this recording at some point or read the blog. Erin, you've done such great work with the blog and giving light to so many different dimensions of church abuse and its cover-up. that there are resources out there, certainly here in Milwaukee, but also nationally. The Faith Trust Institute does terrific work. There are a number of organizations that are trying to provide people tools so that they can respond. And I think too, a way to help pastors with this is to figure out what piece of this could you take on. Instead of just saying, hey, we need to solve this problem or we need to address this, is this something that you and a core group of friends could dedicate a couple hours to every week or every other week or every month, so that you are trying to bring people together for reflection and conversation and some action steps to say, all right, we're going to pray about this, we're going to talk about this, we're going to learn about this, and we're going to do something about this. But I think going back to that case of Les Chambon, like the power of numbers, that this isn't something for a pastor to solve or a parish council to solve or select few volunteers to solve. We have to find ways to bring more people in this and for people to see that they have a role to play in this orchestra of justice.
Excellent. We have another question from an attendee that actually just works very well with what we were just discussing. This is a question from someone who's here this evening who said, how can I, as a busy mom without the bandwidth to launch a new ministry, be supportive to victim survivors around me? It's not a topic that comes up in casual conversation after all. How do I signal to survivors that I am willing to accompany them?
That's a great question. And I think we need to do more of that. All of us, we need to center the voices of survivors, show up to them, say, I acknowledge your pain and I am here with you and holding you, in my heart, or making your prayers my own. That's why I think, we have to make compassion, solidarity, and hope kind of the focus here moving forward, to do that sharing life together. There are a number of survivor networks around the country. I mean, SNAP is the one that's best known. But even in different dioceses, like the work of Paula Kempfer up in the Twin Cities, there are folks, in basically every diocese where they're trying to bring survivors together and minister to them in some way, or to let the survivors minister to each other, because sometimes being in a church space or being closely associated with the church is still very painful and not something they want. So I think to do a little bit of hunting and to look, for a survivor network or community in wherever you are, and to reach out to them. Most do provide email contacts, and you could send an email to say, I am a mom with young children, or, I do have a lot on my plate, and I still want to show this expression of compassion and solidarity. How can I reach out, or what support can I offer? And to do that, in the local level. If you have trouble with that on the local level, I can connect you to other groups. Catholics for Change in our church has many chapters across the country. I mean, there really are a number of grassroots organizations who are doing the work, who I'm sure would be happy to welcome you with open arms and think about the ways that you can try to, do the work wherever you are, to cultivate your plot of this great garden that is the reign of God.
Great. Okay, so here's another question that's somewhat related to what we've already discussed, Marcus, but it's one that obviously we think about at Awake quite a bit. How do we get the average person in the pews to pay attention? So many the Catholic in the pews might not want to think about the abuse crisis. There might be a scandalous headline that momentarily shakes everyone out of their complacency. But I wonder what you're thinking in terms of how to get fellow Catholics to engage with these questions.
Yeah, it's an important question, and I think it points to malformation. I think it points to malformed consciences when we aren't sensitive to the wounds around us, or that we, say, I don't want to hear that, or I have too much going on, or I can't make time for this issue. I mean, I respect that, making it through the pandemic is not easy. I was home with my kids every day for 18 months, trying to help them with remote schooling and also to teach, from home. It was really, really hard. And yet we have to find, kind of bite-sized chunks that can be manageable, right? Like going back to that prayer from Ken Untner that's misattributed to Romero, we're ministers, not messiahs, right? Like there's a piece of this we can take on. And if people are indifferent, in a way that's numbness, that's numb or callous, I think, for some people, they're scared of being exposed to the truth of what's happening in our church or what has happened. They don't know how they're going to be able to handle the pain. And so to be able to share in first person narrative, this is what it's been like for me. Maybe I was scared too, or I was unwilling or reluctant, or I didn't really want to know about what survivors have been through. But it's been really important for me to confront the truth for what it is, right? We can't be ostriches who put our heads in the sand and pretend this problem isn't, not just that is something that has happened in the past, but it's something that continues to persist in our church. So to think about, how can we invite this one person at a time to share the stories of survivors? I mentioned Esther Harbor's witness and testimony last year, to say, I'll watch this with you. Let's make time for this. Because I think sometimes saying we don't have time or we can't go there is a little bit of a cop-out. We spend 11 hours a day on a screen. Parents right now are spending more time watching Netflix than they are with their kids. It wasn't true in the pandemic, but now that everyone's back to normal, right? Like we can be distracted. We can do things to escape the stress and anxiety that we're carrying. I think there is an invitation here, if we're going to take seriously this responsibility to properly form our consciences, to be sensitive to injustice, that we do have to make time, without risking compassion fatigue or being overwhelmed or risking despair, but to make time to say, these are wounds that are affecting people that I am connected to, no matter how close or how far away. That, if you can identify as a parent or as a grandparent or as an aunt or uncle or as a godparent or as someone who just cares about, anyone getting harmed, that we should be able to connect on a human level and to say, no person deserves to be violated in this way. And we can't rest until everyone is safe, whether they're a child or an adult in our church.
Thank you. Thank you. Marcus, we have a very practical question. One of the audience members asks about a statistic that you cited earlier in your talk, the 100,000 survivors of 4,000 clergy who abuse. And the question was just, is that a statistic for the US church only, or is that the whole world?
I believe that's the US Catholic Church. I could be wrong. I pulled that from my notes. I think that's what we know so far. And with the statute of limitations being lifted in New York and people being able to come forward and tell, those numbers are going to change and they're going to increase. And I should point out too, that I think that's another scandal in the church, is the billions of dollars that the church has spent to fight the expansion of statutes of limitations, to keep people out of the courts and from coming forward. If I have this number accurate, I think something like the Archdiocese of New York spent, more than $3 billion trying to fight statute of limitation legislation to prevent survivors from coming forward. When the church is hiding the truth, when it's keeping people from knowing the fullness of what's happened in our church, then the church is deadening people's consciences and betraying its role as what it presents itself to be as a moral guide and teacher.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question, a really tough one from the audience. The crucifix is a violent weapon, and we're not horrified by it. We revere it. Marcus, do you think the crucifixion and other historical violence from the church desensitizes us to sexual assault?
Absolutely. I'm grateful for the question. I think a lot of Christians believe that Jesus came to die, that his crucifixion was fated. Jesus was not plan B, right? Like there's a whole host of reasons why he didn't come just to die, right? Like if he came just to die, then he wasn't really free. Judas wasn't really free. Pontius Pilate wasn't free, right? Like that throws human free will out the window. It also throws out God's omniscience, that God would create a world and then not know how humans would respond to free will, right? So I think it's worth pointing out theologically that we are saved by the incarnation, by God taking human form, by God atoning, reconciling the separation between humanity and God caused by sin. That happens through the incarnation, not the crucifixion. But when people think of Jesus as dying for our sins, as if this were fated from the beginning, then they think that somehow God wanted Jesus to be tortured and killed, right? And that, I think, feeds into those lines like everything happens for a reason, or God has a plan, or we glorify violence rather than to be scandalized by it. We should see the crucifix and shudder that this is how we treated the incarnation of God, who is love. And to see that that wasn't just a historical event 2,000 years ago, right? I don't want to sound anti-Semitic at all and to say that, the Jewish people were responsible for this. Jesus was killed as a threat to the Roman Empire. He was perceived as a threat to Caesar's power. And so to silence him and to scare his followers, he was executed as a criminal, right? Roman citizens could not be crucified because it was reserved for only those subhuman, the category of non-persons. And so it was, for the early Christians, the cross was a sign of scandal and shame. They didn't want to be associated with it. This is why the disciples are fleeing, right? And even after they encounter the risen Christ, they are still locked in a room and cowering in fear. If I were Thomas, I'd be doubting too, because I would say, what? You encountered the risen Christ and you are not changed and transformed and emboldened? You're liars, right? So we've lost that sense of scandal and shame and fear, and too many people do revere it, right? And they do think that God wills violence, or that it is part of God's mysterious plan, rather than to see God lamenting violence and sexual violence in particular with us, right? That God's heart is breaking with survivors and calling the rest of us to do something, not just to bring about healing, but preventing that fate from befalling anyone else.
Great. So Marcus, I'm going to have you sort of shift us to look forward to next week. All of us at Awake are really excited to add this small group element to our courageous events, and to share ideas with one another. So Marcus, as we close the Q&A tonight, can you share a little bit about what you have in mind for next week's conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Erin. So our hope in creating this two-part series is, the hope that, you could join us tonight, and we're so glad that you could, or maybe you're catching the recording on the Awake website a little bit later, but that this would give you some time to really kind of sort through your reflections and reactions in response to this material, and that we would give you a place to then share some of those reflections in conversation with other people. Because I think, this is one of the things that makes me love my job, this opportunity to learn from and with my students, because their insights, their life experiences are so much beyond mine alone. And so we're hoping that in continuing to build the Awake community, that you can have a hand in helping us to see things we can't see by ourselves, or to consider possibilities that we might we maybe haven't imagined just yet, or to pose questions that can help us kind of shift our approach. And if you want to challenge or critique anything that I've said, you're welcome to, right? I said at the beginning, I see this more as a first word than the last word. I'm not trying to present anything as exhaustive or definitive, but to try to provide you some food for thought, so that we can feel, some illumination about what's been happening, and to try to make sense of it, but also some encouragement about where do we go from here? How do we think, speak, feel, and act differently in light of this? So I have some questions just to propose to you, to kind of get the wheels turning. This is not necessarily where we have to head next Thursday, but just, if you want to take a screenshot of these questions, or take a couple notes, I just thought it would kind of give you a place to begin in reflecting on what you would like to say in response to this presentation. And my hope is just that by coming together, we'll have some time in small group and some time in large group next week, that we can just continue the conversation and learn from and with one another.